I'm going to start. Oh, you started the recording. Perfect. All right. Well, welcome, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Dave Maroney. I'm a conservation planning specialist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and I'll be presenting along with Jens here today on using BioFinder 4.0. And thank you so much for taking some time to join us today. And we are using Microsoft Teams. We know some familiar faces. You've joined us for webinars in the past, but a couple of our housekeeping notes. Please keep yourself muted to cut down any background noise or feedback. Also, the chat feature here is one of our favorite tools. You can use that at any time to put questions that you might have. You can type those, your questions or comments, directly into the chat during the presentation. And one of us, Jens or I, will always be keeping tabs on the chat so we can collect those questions and read them back. And we'll pause several times throughout the presentation, so there's an opportunity to read those questions and potentially take live questions as well. The chat's also a great opportunity to have a little bit of dialogue and help us introduce each other and have a sense of where we're all coming from. So if you'd like to, encourage you to type your name and your town, or if you're representing an organization today, you can type that into the chat so you all can get a sense for the spread that is joining the presentation today. All right, so Jens and I are here representing the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Our mission is the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And we make up the Community Wildlife Program. So our piece of that mission is to offer free technical assistance to Vermont municipalities on all kinds of issues related to conservation planning. Now, that's what brings us to this webinar presentation in this series that we've been conducting all spring, but it also brings us directly to towns. We're here to support planning, support conservation, and help you understand the ecological and community context in which you live. So please feel free to reach out for us for general assistance. And also, if you have any questions from the presentation today. All right, so our focus today is using BioFinder 4.0. This is a fantastic tool that's going to allow you to do a lot of exploration and answer a lot of questions related to conservation on your own. And so we're going to walk you through this tool in 3 different sections. First, a little bit of background information on what is BioFinder as a tool and what is Vermont Conservation Design, which is intimately related to BioFinder, as you'll see. Then we're going to talk about some of the basic functionalities of this online tool. And we're going to close with an advanced tutorial, which is going to look at some of the more advanced elements of the tool. And also, Jens will be running us through a bit of a live demo. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed to the technology. Hope that it works with us in live demo. There's always a little bit of a risk, but I think it'll be worth it. All right, so we're going to jump right into that first segment and answer the question, what is BioFinder? Now, if you come to the presentation today, you may have some familiarity with a past version of the BioFinder tool, or you may have simply seen our webinar schedule and been curious. So BioFinder is a database of all kinds of different information types and a mapping tool that helps identify features that underlie the patterns of biodiversity across Vermont. That's really the focus. So it identifies different kinds of lands and waters that support important ecosystems, natural communities, habitats, and species. Now, the way that BioFinder primarily works is it features visualizations of these data sets that come from Vermont Conservation Design. If you're unfamiliar with Vermont Conservation Design, we'll talk a little bit about it. This is a design set that was developed by the Agency of Natural Resources and a whole bunch of partners across the state to support stewardship, conservation, and land use planning. So you'll get a sense for what that is pretty soon. Now, with that, BioFinder as a free online tool that helps you visualize all kinds of data is really a bridge between state-sponsored conservation science and community-powered land use planning. And that's really our goal, is to put these tools that we've developed at the state level with all kinds of partners into your hands so you can use them for free in individual decisions and community decisions and municipality-based decisions. Lastly, BioFinder and Vermont Conservation Design were both updated in March 2024. So we're excited to join you today to talk a little bit about some of the changes that came with that update that prompted our outreach efforts this spring. All right, so before we get into the functionality of BioFinder itself, we need to briefly answer this question: what is Vermont Conservation Design? So we're going to share a short overview of VCD, as we call it for short, but we also want you to walk away from this webinar with some more in-depth resources in case you have questions and want a deeper level of explanation and detail. So in the chat, we're going to share a link to an ArcGIS story map, which you'll see just this quick screenshot from that we put together and released in February that explains VCD in a thorough but straightforward and visually engaging manner. So we encourage you to check that out. And we also have one more webinar later this spring that dives into the science behind Vermont Conservation Design. But with that, let's take some time for a quick intro, because it's going to help you understand what you're able to see and visualize on BioFinder. So Vermont Conservation Design is, at its core, a science-based vision to sustain the state's natural areas, forests, waters, wildlife, and plants for future generations. This is a long-term vision. And Vermont Conservation Design in that is both a huge assemblage of different kinds of natural heritage information, as well as a vision for how all that information fits together into a bigger picture. So BioFinder allows the data that went into designing this vision to be visualized spatially and interacted with on this online mapping platform. On a more concrete level, Vermont Conservation Design is a prioritization that identifies the most important lands and waters across Vermont for maintaining ecological function based on a number of criteria. So we can think of it as a series of component maps that add up to a single overall priorities map that dictates a vision for what we call an ecologically functional landscape. You'll see a little image of that landscape here on the slide. Now, if we protect and maintain this ecologically functional landscape, these natural features will be maintained, we'll be maintaining nature for its own sake, and also for the benefits that it provides to all the people who live here. So that includes our economic benefits, the sustainable forest products that we get from healthy ecosystems, recreation, clean air and water, and flood mitigation. And VCD also serves as a conservation framework statewide that can unite all different independent municipalities and conservation organizations in working together towards a bigger picture across the state. Now, when I say ecologically functional landscape, or we're talking about ecological function, we're referring to this degree to which an ecosystem can function under the natural processes that would govern it. And that includes allowing all its plants and animals to thrive and reproduce and migrate, and also to move in response to environmental change. So this ecologically functional landscape that is envisioned by Vermont Conservation Design is a landscape where black bear and moose, for example, can roam the wide areas that they need to meet their biological needs while crossing roads safely and avoiding human conflict. We also know that Vermont is becoming warmer and wetter on average, and the organisms that live here need to be able to respond to this, both through adaptation, but also through long-term migration. Some species that live here today in Vermont are going to migrate more northwards, and we may lose them over time. Other species will be coming here from more southern regions, and we need to make sure there's the landscape that can support them in that. We also want to make sure in this vision that rivers are connected to their floodplains, predator and prey are present on the landscape, forests can grow wild and old, or can experience natural disturbances through wind and fire and regenerate into young forests, right? So this is a vision for a landscape that incorporates all these components and all the different landforms, species, and natural history that makes Vermont special are accounted for and protected. So when you look at Vermont Conservation Design information using BioFinder, you'll see that it's organized by scale. So the highest level, we have the landscape scale, where large patches of forest and habitat are visualized. And these are areas that serve multiple key functions for plants and animals. So Vermont Conservation Design asks important questions like, where are the largest and most intact forest blocks within each region of the state? And those are mapped and prioritized and labeled as independent forest or interior forest blocks. Right? It asks the question, where are the habitat patches that are most important for terrestrial connectivity across the entire state? And those are connectivity blocks. Where can we ensure that all different kinds of geological and topographic landforms are represented in their natural state? Those are the geological diversity blocks. And where are the lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams? And where is there intact riparian vegetation along the margins of those aquatic systems? So these are all big picture landscape elements that are mapped and viewable on BioFinder. Now, the other components of Vermont conservation design occur at smaller scales, and we're lumping those together for brevity into what we call the species and community scale components. And those are visualized also on BioFinder. So at that level, at that finer level of focus, VCD maps components such as natural communities, which we can think of as these specialized habitat types. They're specific assemblages of plants, animals, and their environment that occur across the landscape in repeating units. And many of them have names, some of which you might recognize, like northern hardwood forest. We also map aquatic habitats, vernal pools, wetlands, wildlife road crossings, and rare, threatened, and endangered species occurrences that are known. And all of that information can also be visualized on BioFinder. Now, in addition to mapping these different elements, the components of Vermont conservation design receive a priority rank in two different levels, highest priority or a priority. Now, highest priority features are usually those that are contributing the most to meeting the key functions of each component, while priority features are usually serving some kind of supporting role, such as providing a safety buffer in terms of having redundancy of important landscape features. So if one is lost, there's still that feature on the landscape. So this is a relatively simple prioritization system, and it's meant to direct us to important patterns and not to answer all of the conservation questions for us. So, ultimately, in the kinds of decision making and planning decisions that we're going to do at the municipal scale, we're going to be zooming in a lot greater detail. And Vermont conservation design is going to help point us to the important questions that need to be answered at those finer levels of detail. Now, the components of Vermont conservation design are combined to produce an overall priorities map for each conservation scale. And that's what you're seeing here on the screen. This is the Vermont conservation design overall priorities at the landscape scale, represented in the dark green and the lime green. And this is actually the default view for the BioFinder website. So when you load the website, we'll talk about that in our second section in just a minute. You're going to see this green prioritization cover the screen. Now, it's important to note that the areas mapped in green here cover over 70% of the state. So again, these maps aren't intended to replace things like zoning maps or town plans or any manner of these careful land use planning decisions that are made at the town scale. But it's a very important tool for ensuring that all of the decisions that get made at that scale are calibrated to this statewide vision for ecologically sustainability. All right, so before we take a break and move on to using BioFinder, let's take a moment to highlight the new updates for both Vermont Conservation Design and BioFinder. And the first thing that we can say that's probably the most important change is that there's been a huge increase in the mapping resolution that was used for the forest blocks in the riparian connectivity layers. Now, forest blocks are the sort of raw elements of all those landscape layers that I mentioned, interior forest blocks, connectivity blocks. And the resolution that was used for this new data set is actually 3,600 times greater than the resolution used in the past data set, which is pretty impressive. And we'll show an example of the consequences of using this improved resolution in just before the break. A couple of the components of VCD have been redesigned using slightly different analytical techniques. So geological diversity blocks has been redesigned a little bit, and the wildlife road crossings component has been redesigned. There are updated data sets, including updates from the past couple of years. Natural communities, vernal pools, rare and uncommon species, those have been updated. And some minor prioritization adjustments have been made for interior forest blocks and connectivity blocks. Also on the BioFinder mapping tool, The first thing that we want to point out is that there's actually a new URL for the updated BioFinder. It's BioFinder 4. When you go there, you'll see that in the URL at the end, BioFinder 4. And we point this out because the old BioFinder, which just simply says BioFinder at the top, is still out there. So if you have a bookmarked link, for example, for the past iteration of the BioFinder tool, keep that in mind because you'll need to change that over to the new tool. It's a separate link, and it's not replacing the old one directly at this time. There's also been some minor interface simplifications, and some of the menus have changed a little bit. All right, I did promise a quick example of this improved resolution for mapping forest blocks, so I'll walk you through that. At the top of the screen, we're seeing an example of an aerial photo from Waitsfield, Vermont. And we see here 2 habitat blocks on either side of this road, a little bit of a town center in the background, and then some residential development dotting the landscape on either side of the road. So if you look at the bottom left, you'll see the way that the forest blocks data sets looked in the 2011 data, which was when the last time that these data sets were updated and redesigned. And you'll see that it looks pretty blocky, and it does a decent job of highlighting where the habitat blocks are, but you'll also notice that a lot of green is left out. Now, on the right, you'll see the updated blocks, and the greater resolution means that the edges of these forest blocks are visualized in a lot better detail. And so it does a better job of covering the areas that are true natural cover on the landscape. So you can see that each of the homes has a 150-foot buffer around it, and that produces this sort of Swiss cheese effect, and you can really get a good sense of where residential development has intersected and compromised a little bit the integrity of forest blocks. But one of the features we're really excited about is this improved resolution also gives us better coverage of the landscape, and particularly in regards to edges and where those edges come down to the road. And that helps us better predict areas of wildlife road crossings. So we have a lot better insight into the highest probability areas of the landscape where wildlife are going to be seeking to cross the road, where there's good natural cover on both sides. And that's what the arrow is pointing to on the right. It's showing us this segment that was missed in the previous data set, where you have good natural cover on both sides of this major road, which is going to be a high probability for wildlife seeking out crossings. With that, we're going to take a break after our introduction here, and we have an opportunity to answer any questions, and then we'll move on to our second segment.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jens Hilke. I work with Dave at Community Wildlife Program. I'm just managing the back end for this first segment. Dave, there are no questions in the chat at this time. Katie just wrote in. Out of curiosity, what was the change in satellite imagery platform capabilities that has allowed for this updated resolution?
Great question, Katie. I think Jens may have some insight. Jens, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Katie, we use the UVM LiDAR-derived land cover data. So it's a 2016, but that input data has a 0.5 meter resolution pixel, and it uses the first returns, from the LiDAR when they send the beam down and it comes back. So it really does a great job of assessing vegetation height. And that's why we're getting such better resolution. It's particularly good, as Dave just said, for the edges of the block. But it's the use of that new LiDAR-derived land cover that really did it for us. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a follow-up question or whatever. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much. I was curious about that. I mean, we've seen such great strides over the past few years. I was curious where the data was coming from for this project. Thanks.
Yeah. And Katie, I saw you on the Resilient Rivers webinar the other day, and this LiDAR-derived land cover data really improved the riparian connectivity data set. And for that one, we're going down to forest patches of 1 acre or greater, whereas the forest blocks are 20 acres or greater. So that riparian connectivity data set has really sprung forward quite a bit as well.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Jens. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the LiDAR data set actually comes from an airplane. as opposed to a satellite. So that's one of the things that allows it to get a higher resolution than some of those satellites can actually get.
I don't see anyone else coming off mute, but you will have an opportunity for more questions at the next segment. Dave, why don't you take it away?
Perfect. All right. Yeah. Thank you for questions. Keep them coming as they pop up. Questions and comments are welcome. All right. So we're going to jump into talking a little bit about BioFinder as a tool, how you can use it to get the most out of it, and the kinds of questions and information that it can tell you. So here we are looking at a quick screen capture of when you load BioFinder, what it really looks like. You've got a map on the left, and if you click on the left, it'll open up this panel where you have all different kinds of layers of data that you can turn on and off. And on the right, your mapping window, you have the capacity to zoom in and out, to pan around. The top of the screen, there's a search bar that'll help you locate specific areas. There's quick tools that can help you zoom into town level. And so there's a lot of useful features just for investigating the landscape as a mapping tool. But let's dive into the functionality and some of the key layers that are visualized and how you can turn those off and kind of investigate what they're showing you. Okay, so when you load BioFinder, I mentioned that the default view is that it's showing this overall priorities on the landscape scale from Vermont Conservation Design. So we see that in dark green and lime green. Also turned on by default is an ANR base map, Agency of Natural Resources, that includes some useful base map data such as highways, roads, town and county boundaries. And those will update automatically as you zoom in. So here at the state level, we're really just seeing the major highways, but as you zoom in, you'll also see roads. That can, of course, be turned on, and you can turn on anything. You can customize what you want shown. So if you just want roads or boundaries or any other kinds of features that are in the base map data set. Now notice here that the base map here is satellite imagery. So with our green prioritization over a green background, at this level, we can't really make out a lot of it, differences. So ultimately, BioFinder, is intended for you to be able to zoom in to the town level or beyond, or the county level, so that you can make sense of the patterns that are occurring at those scales and connect them to the larger picture. And you can change your base map from the default satellite. There's a couple different options, including a topo map that you can select. All right, now these overall priorities from Vermont Conservation Design, of course, occur at two scales. On the left is that landscape scale that we started with. And I want to highlight right from the start that each of these scales should be treated a little bit differently in terms of how we're extracting lessons and conclusions that might relate to conservation and land use planning. So at the landscape scale, any of the features that are visualized, based on these habitat blocks or forest blocks that we've mentioned a couple times, these are generally larger areas of the landscape that are designed to show patterns, right? And these are areas with broad functions like connectivity or interior forest conditions. And so they also inherently have greater flexibility to accommodate human use and development, so long as we preserve the underlying pattern that makes that area an ecological priority in the first place. So our objective in kind of investigating elements at the landscape scale is to understand the patterns that are being shown and to think about how we can preserve those patterns. Now, if you turn off that layer and turn on the species and community scale overall priorities, you'll get finer scale details. So these little dots will pop up. You zoom in, you can start investigating those dots and polygons. And remember that these represent things like wetlands, special habitat types, and things like known occurrences of uncommon species. And so these areas of the landscape we generally think of as hotspots of habitat value and biodiversity. And so they're also areas that are inherently less flexible to accommodate land use changes and human disturbance. So we have to think of those in terms of protecting them and conserving them a little more rigidly than we would think about landscape patterns. All right, so when you get tired of looking at green and sort of the overall prioritization that is on by default, it's time to kind of move beyond the overall priorities layer and start to unpack it into its components. And that's really how BioFinder is intended to be used. We're intended to ask questions of the data that is presented to us. Right? It's one thing just to look at data, and it's another to really ask what questions can it answer for us. So for any of the area of the landscape in which we're interested, we really want to start with this question: why is it ecologically important? So Vermont Conservation Design, years of information collecting and thinking and prioritizing went into this project. And so we know that everything that's shown here has been flagged in some ways ecologically important. And so BioFinder is going to give us the answer of, why was this flagged and why is this being shown on the screen as ecologically important? And once we know that, we can start to answer questions about how we might protect it or how we might, accommodate the things that we're trying to do for our communities in the landscape, but while also preserving those natural heritage elements. So to do that, all we really have to do is click. So if you see the arrow here, the purple arrow, if I were to click on this habitat block, up would come this little box that breaks down the overall highest priorities into its landscape level components. And so we'll see that this particular block has been highlighted as highest priority for a couple different reasons. Its connectivity value, its riparian connectivity value, its surface water priority, right? And so we can start to unpack what this overall prioritization is showing us. Now, many of you may want to simply jump into BioFinder and start clicking and start learning on the fly about what everything it has to tell you. And that's really how this tool has been designed. We want people with relatively limited experience to be able to jump in and look at this data and start learning. And so what you'll notice is that all of the blue headings on the left for the different components are actually links. And if you click on them in detail, what you will get is a component summary that describes in detail what that element is, why it's important, and it'll provide technical details about how this map was made and how the prioritization was put together. Why some areas were chosen to be highest priority and why some were just chosen to be priority, and why other areas may have been left out of that particular data set. So all that information is there. If you don't remember what a connectivity block is, or you don't remember what geological priority is. And we can do that just by clicking on the links that pop up when we select different areas of the landscape. Now from there, it's time to start unpacking that overall priority and visualizing components one at a time. So that those interior forest blocks, those connectivity blocks, we can visualize each of those layers just individually without the overall priorities masking it. And so the way to do that is by using the layers menu at the left side of the screen. You'll notice that there's check boxes for all the different data categories, and those can be clicked on and off to change the map and what is shown. So usually the first step is to turn off that overall priorities, because that's going to tend to mask everything. And then the plus signs show categories that can be expanded with different options. So if I want to visualize the individual landscape scale component layers, I simply click the plus. That's going to expand the menu, and we're going to see the interior forest blocks, the connectivity blocks, all of those different components that went into that overall design. So here's an example. I've got just the interior forest blocks turned on. And so here we have a color map that shows the highest priority in dark purple and the priority areas in a lighter purple. And so what I can get a sense of, my target area of the landscape is actually this. I was interested in understanding more about this area right here where the pointer is shown. And it turns out that that area is located in the highest priority interior forest block. So right away, I understand one of the reasons why this was flagged as ecologically important, right? This block is larger and it's more intact than all the neighboring blocks that are separated by roads, agriculture, and development. And that's really important. That's something that we want to try to preserve on the landscape if possible, because by virtue of its size and the degree of intactness, it's providing these deep interior forest conditions that many of the other blocks may not be. And that's going to mean habitat for certain species that can't make it as well in highly fragmented landscape and edges. And it's going to mean certain forest processes that also can't happen to the same degree in smaller blocks. So here we can see that we have, a certain degree of patchiness. And if we zoom in closer, we'll see some of that as homes and driveways that penetrate into the center of the block. So our priority in preserving the pattern here is going to be to prevent that kind of development from, bisecting this block and carving it up into smaller blocks. And we're going to want to think about, in compromising the different kinds of development and protection strategies that might happen at a town level, we're going to want to think about maybe clustering development around the periphery of a block like this and preventing any kind of development from going into the center. Because again, that's the ecological value that is being highlighted here, is that interior forest condition. So that's the kind of investigation that we can do by walking through these component data sets one at a time and thinking about the values that are represented on the landscape. All right, now there's a lot of data, raw data associated with each block and component, and that can be viewed by clicking on any of the blocks that are highlighted. Up will pop a little window, and at the bottom left of that window, you'll see View Additional Details. And so if you click on View Additional Details, you'll get a panel that shows you a lot of those raw data information and different kinds of calculated metrics. So we can see the total area of the habitat block, for example. We can see the core area, which is a measure of that interior, how much interior forest is there. We can see things like road and trail density to the degree that they're known. I will mention that certain things like trails, we only have a certain sense at the state level of where all the trails are. So some of these are calculated just based on the best information. And especially at the town level, there's often more data that can be brought in to supplement the things that are shown on Vermont Conservation Design in BioFinder. So all kinds of information, acres of core habitat, percent water, and that's all visible simply by viewing additional details. As you work your way through the different component layers of Vermont Conservation Design, on BioFinder, you're essentially exploring what we call this prioritization theme, which is the default set of data that are shown in that panel at the left. And that's really what makes BioFinder BioFinder. It's set up by default to make all of those Vermont Conservation Design components that prioritize important lands and waters easily visible and easily accessible. But there's a whole bunch more data that's viewable if you know where to click. And a lot of that data is organized around different themes. So there's a drop-down menu at the top left. You'll see pictured on the screen here. And you can switch from prioritization to an inventory theme. Inventory will include a lot of different kinds of raw data that went into developing the Vermont Conservation Design data sets. Things like land cover types, raw habitat block information organized by acreage, and different kinds of natural heritage elements that are mapped, like deer wintering areas. And there's also social and environmental factors which can be shown. That has information such as socioeconomic and demographic data, housing and transportation data, parcelization trends in different towns and municipalities, and also land value trends. So a quick summary: prioritization, that's that Vermont Conservation Design layers primarily. Inventory, a whole bunch of raw data, and social and environmental factors that help us understand, who lives where and where there are vulnerable populations in the landscape. And I want to expand on that last theme because it's sometimes overlooked a little bit. So here's an example of something that we can see in the social environmental factors theme. This is the Social Vulnerability Index, which is a metric that helps us flag important issues related to socioeconomic and demographic trends and housing and transportation trends in different municipalities. And we recognize that many people come to BioFinder primarily to visualize the ecological elements of the landscape, but this is actually a really cool and important factor of what BioFinder can do. It can allow us to compare and look at both sides of the coin, so to speak, right? We can visualize all of these amazing environmental data sets, the natural heritage elements, but we can also then bring into play questions of conservation ethics and start to overlap those natural heritage priorities onto our maps of where there are vulnerable communities in the state. So we can start to ask questions about how different land use planning decisions might affect different communities of people. And ultimately, the goal here is that we want to be taking care of the communities all around Vermont. And that's the natural communities, right? Our communities of plants and animals, and also these communities of people. because ultimately this tool is designed to help us in this challenging balancing act, right, that is protecting our environment and our natural heritage while also ensuring that we have healthy economies, healthy communities that can all thrive together. All right, now one last point before we go into a break and take an opportunity to answer questions. The best way to gain facility with BioFinder is just to launch the map and experiment for yourself. But we also recognize that some people might be interested in interacting with this data offline, and BioFinder will help you do that. There's a couple of ways to do it. I'll just briefly mention. We're going to share a resource that will allow you to bring the Vermont Conservation Design datasets as visualized in BioFinder into a mapping program, a geographic information systems program such as ArcGIS. So we'll share that in the chat. But you can also download information directly off BioFinder. If you click on the Tools button, which is generally the upper right side of the screen, you'll see it when you start to experiment with BioFinder. And there's a Map Data tab. And under that Map Data tab, there'll be several different download links that can allow you to download this information and use it in various desktop programs offline, such as QGIS and ArcGIS Pro. So we just want to highlight that there is that offline functionality built into BioFinder as well, even though it's a free online mapping tool, that it's going to allow really you to replicate many of the things that you could do in one of those programs. All right, so let's head into our next break. We'll have an opportunity for questions, and then I'll hand the reins over to Jens to tell us a little bit about some of the advanced tools that come along with BioFinder and take us on a live tutorial.
Nothing in the chat at this time, Dave.
Perfect. If anyone has a question that you'd like to ask live, we have the opportunity before we move on.
Yeah, I've got a brief question. I'm not sure if you'll be able to fully answer this one. It's a little bit detailed. But I'm having a hard time understanding what the social vulnerability index score means under the social environmental factors. Do you have any kind of background as to what those numbers refer to?
Can I jump in, Dave?
Go ahead, Jens.
Yeah. So those are the total number of flags. So they flag certain more vulnerable populations by Census Bureau. So Dave talked about the three sub-themes, and so they just total up the number of flags, and that's the main score for the social vulnerability index. But then you can dig into those components like the housing or the socioeconomic and look at the actual raw data for each of those census blocks and see for poverty rates, you'll see the classifications of different poverty rates and see how each of the census blocks compares. Does that help?
Gotcha. I understand. It's kind of a culmination of all the other factors. Gotcha.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Jens, I believe that data comes from the Department of Health.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So it's worth mentioning that BioFinder is a tool. If anyone's familiar with the ANR Atlas, for example, those mapping tools are very similar, and actually you can access any of the data that is present in either of those sources on either one, but they're set up differently so that you can, some things are easier to access. So ANR Atlas has a different organization. BioFinder, the organization, is all about kind of showing these overall prioritizations and helping people make conservation decisions by putting together these patterns and components into an overall picture. So adding that theme of social environmental factors, we think is an important component of that. But that data is all connected to these databases that have come from different organizations across the state.
Yeah, I've got a question, Dave, again. So maybe you're going to go over this in the next part of it. But has the printing function been simplified so that when you get these maps on the screen, you can actually easily print them out to show people when you're not?
Tom, it's not much better. No, that's all out of the box functionality that we can't really control. And I find it just as difficult as ever to do the print. We can go through it together and I'll show you. The main problem is because our base map, to make it load quickly, it's a series of tiled layers, but to print them, you have to turn the layers on individually. So I think you were in our environmental leadership training when we went through that, and it hasn't gotten any better.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
thanks for that. All right, so I'm gonna stop my screen share and we'll take an opportunity to head over to our next segment. I'm gonna hand the reins over to Jens, and here we go.
All right. Well, thanks, Dave. So I just wanted to offer a kind of a real world example of the kinds of things that we often use BioFinder for. And a lot of towns are wrestling with the Forest Integrity Act, the Forest Integrity Law, Act 171. And that requires towns and regional planning commissions in their town plans or regional plans to identify areas that are important as forest blocks and connectors and plan for development in those areas as a way to minimize forest fragmentation. And so for us, that means you have to include a map in your town plan of your forest blocks and connectors. This law has been on the books, or this planning provision of the law has been on the books since 2018. So most towns have already taken a crack at that, given that we're on an 8-year planning cycle, but not all towns have. And many of the towns that have already done one town plan review might want to further clarify those blocks and connectors for their next town plan. So let me just give you an example of what this might look like. So here's the town of Heinsberg, and at left is the overall priorities at the landscape scale. So again, that dark green is highest priority, that light green is priority. And then at right are the highest priority interior forests in that purple, dark purple. And then below that, the highest priority connectivity blocks in that bright orange, and the priority in the brown. And so these together, these layers can give you a sense of those overall priorities. Now, I just want to stress that this is a statewide prioritization. And so it doesn't get things right all the time at the town level. So here in Heinsberg, those blocks at right to the sorry, I'm in the main map, but the blocks to the east are all considered priority. And yet those are some of the largest blocks in Heinsberg. So when Heinsberg went to do its map for its town plan, it did in fact call those highest priority from the town perspective. And so that's really important to understand that Vermont conservation design is a great starting place for Act 171 mapping, but you're not required to use the highest priority areas in the conservation design. Some towns, 80, 90% of the town might be highest priority, and community values might suggest that there are other uses for some forest blocks. So there's a little bit of a give and take, but I do suggest that VCD, Vermont Conservation Design, and the BioFinder website are the best starting place. So let's just do a live tutorial here, and we'll see how that goes. And what I'd like to do is show you how to use the Identify tool to list out all the habitat blocks in a region, and then curate that list of blocks and then export it as a shapefile. I'll also show you how you can bring other shapefiles back into BioFinder and also view some of the additional data sets. So here we go. All right, so on screen is the live BioFinder website. I go to the left, click here to begin, and then I see that that maps the same list of layers. I'm going to go to the quick tools and I'll zoom in. Let's zoom into Ferrisburg. There's somebody for this. So I just start typing. I hit Ferrisburg. I hit OK. And it automatically zooms us in. And then I can turn off, I think, first of all, I can get a sense of the overall prioritization. As Dave said, I can just left click here and begin to see why things are our highest priority. And in Ferrisburg, a town in the Champlain Valley, you know, it's really this surface water that knit the forest blocks together. And so a lot of these dark green areas that I'm seeing are highest priority because of surface waters. But I can dig into that more and turn that off and then open the group and start looking at the interior forest. And I can see some of those patches of forest. And then I can turn multiple ones on. And so you can see in brown there, that's how the riparian connectivity connects some of these forest blocks. Okay, so not all habitat blocks are highest priority in the conservation design. So I'm just going to switch over to the inventory side of things. I'm going to open the forest pattern map, and I'm just going to display the new habitat blocks. And so you can see some of these smaller blocks weren't considered highest priority for the conservation design, but maybe you wanted to include those in the town map for Act 171. So now I'm going to open the toolbox. I'm going to go to the identify, and I'm going to make a polygon. And essentially, I'm just going to grab every block, all the forest blocks here in Ferrisburg. So I just clicked once. You see that black line. I'm going to click once again. And I'm just doing a rough version here. So this isn't going to be exact. Across, and now I double clicked. Okay, so that was a rough one, but in total, it grabbed 49 habitat blocks, okay, in this rough area that is Ferrisburg plus. So I could just take that selection and export it as a shapefile. And I could share that shapefile with other members of the commission. I could share that with our regional planning commission, whomever it might be, and say, hey, these are all of the habitat blocks in Ferrisburg. I could also go through and curate this list. So I could delete certain blocks. So I'm just going to sort these based on acreage. And so I could delete from our selection these smallest blocks. Now you see I'm hovering over this first one and it turns blue on screen. That's a 21 acre. And I'll just do that to the next one. So I can literally highlight these blocks, and then I can just click on those dots and remove from results. So that's how I could curate my block list. I can go one by one, see what the selection is, and just remove results. You can see here in the total that it's now down to 48. Maybe I'll just get rid of this one as well, remove it. And so you can begin to piece together your own selection of blocks for Act 171. You can do this with other data sets as well. So now I'm going to, excuse me, I'm going to go up here beside identify results. We call this the hamburger menu. And I'm just going to click on that, and I'm going to export to shapefile. Now it is working. The shapefile is about to be downloaded. Okay, confirm. So that went, I'm on a Windows machine. And so that went into my downloads folder as export.zip. This is a pretty big one. I'll just show you one other tool that we can export as well. Just cleaning up our screen. I'm getting rid of our selection. You can also draw And so maybe you wanted to highlight a particularly important segment of town, again, for spatial communication. So I'm just drawing a polygon right now. I'm double-click to finish it. And so here I have a drawing. Again, I can export that drawing as a shapefile. Okay. So now I have another in my downloads file. Now let me show you. So now I'm going to clear the drawings. Everything's gone. And now I'm just going to go to the map data tab, and I'm going to upload data. So I can bring in new data. And what I'm going to do is I hit choose file. I'm going to go to my downloads. I'm going to bring in my drawing just because it's a little smaller. It'll load quicker. And I'm going to hit OK. Then I say upload. It asks me to name it area of interest. I'm going to avoid the greens and go into some purples and hit proceed. And so here's that drawing that I just did. Now, the advantage of bringing in a drawing or bringing in this selection of habitat blocks is that you can turn it on and off. You can make it transparent or not. You can also look at it with other themes in mind. So here's that prioritization, and I can see my area of interest in that prioritization theme. I can even look at it for social and environmental factors. And begin to explore perhaps some of the socioeconomic data, like poverty rates in this region, which are not high. So anyway, the idea of having this extra shapefile that you can turn on and off, you can change the transparency, allows you to interact with other data sets. And that's different than if you just had the selection within BioFinder. I just want you to know that you can also add any other data that is available on the ANR Atlas or on the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. So I was on the map data tab. I went to layer catalog. Now I'm going to open every single layer in the Natural Resource Atlas. And maybe I can add in, why don't I add in the river corridors from the Department of Environmental Conservation, and hit OK. And now up here, our river corridors are added. So you can see that my area of interest is also a DEC river corridor. But literally any data set that's on the Atlas or on VCGI can be added in that manner. You can also add your own shape files through that upload data tab as I described. So those are a few of the sort of bells and whistles of exporting, identifying a series of elements, exporting those as a shapefile, bringing them back in, and also adding additional data. Now, let's stop for a second and check in. Real world questions. How are we doing? Feel free to unmute your mics or ask if you see if you have any questions.
Yeah, no questions in the chat. So yeah, please feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
Jens, thank you for that. This is Don DeWeese. I'm from Ferrisburg. Thanks for your selection of the example. Maybe you were just goading me to say something. In any case, we are at the point that you mentioned of many towns up against a deadline for a revision of the town plan, looking at Act 171 requirements. And at the same time, some of us trying to learn some of these basics. And I'm sort of nowhere with the ANR mapping and the BioFinder, but know that it's of great value. So I have questions like, this is very valuable in itself, your exposition here. Where would you go first for sort of the nuts and bolts, step by step. You know, if you want to do this, you know, owner's manual, operator's manual for this this tool.
Yeah, thanks, Don. There are a couple places. So the BioFinder homepage, this is different than the map page that I shared in the links. Dave just put it in the chat for us. There's a resources section that has some handouts. So those are some of the step-by-step guides to how to do this stuff.
Okay.
The other place is Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage. And that's a huge document that is our guidebook for how to use BioFinder for land use planning and Act 171 type work in particular.
Okay. That's been around for quite a while, correct?
It's one of the two green books. So the first green book was Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage. This one was released in 2018. We sent a copy to the town. It also has the DVD with it. And this one's, so it's same color intentionally, but this one's Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage.
Okay.
So it's a little different than the one that's been around since 2004.
Okay.
Yeah. And Don, we're happy to help. Always love working with Ferrisburg. I've worked with your Conservation Commission many times. Happy to help.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We definitely see you guys as a resource.
Awesome. Other questions that I can answer while we're together? Feel free to take yourself off mute. We got time, folks. I'm happy to help. All right. Last thing I want to say is please remember what Dave said. Click with reckless abandon. You cannot break BioFinder. There is nothing that you can do on your end that will break BioFinder on our end. So just click around. Worst thing that happens is it freezes and you need to reload it. So just don't worry about it. I mean, that's what separates me from my kids. My kids just go off and click wherever and they learn so much more quickly. I'm much more cautious. But in this case, follow my kids' lead and click with reckless abandon. And just that's probably the best way to learn more about BioFinder. Dave, thank you so much for your part. Folks, thank you all so much for attending. A real pleasure to be with you today. Let us know if we can help in the future. Have a great one.
Thanks so much, Jens.
Thank you both.
Really appreciate it. I'll probably be reaching out to you as I have some grad school projects coming up and might need some assistance sorting through things. So really appreciate it.
Happy to help, Katie. Take care, you all.
Absolutely. Bye.
Okay. Yeah, thank you all. Have a great day.